This morning I need to get a little bit of a sense of the audience before I go too far. So if you have a yard or have had a yard in the past, how many of you had the yard where all of the grass is perfect, well kept, the edging is all done, it's watered and all grows and is green and really looks kind of pristine? We have one. Most of the rest of you, I'm guessing, then have a yard that's more like mine. Our yard, our neighbors, we have neighbors with very nice yards, and they look at us and they say, "You guys have done a great job with the yard, keep up the good work." Now that sounds like a compliment, and I think it is meant to be a compliment. In the first year that we lived in our house, we put out 7 trash cans full of yard waste every week, as we tamed some of the wildness that was there. That being said, I will not water or put chemicals on my lawn, and so our grass is, grass might be a loose use there. It is grass and other green things. Some people call them weeds. It is what's there. Some of them grow faster than others. They have different color of flowers. Some of them have little thorns, whatever. But it is what grows, and our approach to our yard is basically what it will be is what it is. So if you can survive without being cared for, then you can be in our yard. And if you need a lot of care, probably not. And so we have some trees. We have some crepe myrtles. And I notice around the community that at some point in time, we're supposed to just chop those off so they can thrive. We just let them be. Our backyard is even worse than our front yard. It's got more sand. But then we have a compost bin where we put all of our leaves and food scraps. We have 2 rain barrels where we collect water to water the compost and a little bit of a tenth of a garden that we have. And then we have a whole bunch of potted plants, some of which do get watered, orchids and whatnot. But most of our yard, our approach is if you need care, good luck. And if you don't, then good for you. So all of this I say that I think our neighbors are really wanting us to do more, so that I think our neighbor next door actually fertilizes part of our grass to keep it at bay. So it doesn't get too close to his house. Now, for as much as I think they may be judging our yard, my wife and I will go walk around the neighborhood, and I got to tell you, our yard's not that bad. There are some, when we walk by, it's mostly sand, and just as our neighbors may look at ours, we kind of look at that and go, boy, that's really bad. And then there's others that are so overgrown that I'm afraid to walk next to it, because there might be something living in it that I don't want to encounter. There are others that don't edge, and so the sidewalk just keeps getting narrower as their growth comes out over the sidewalk. And I look at those and think, gosh, that is a terrible looking yard. Thinking then that my yard is really much better than it probably is, right? But I can judge other yards against mine and feel better about the way that we care for ours. Now I share all of this about our yard because our gospel story today begins with Jesus having a conversation with some people about current events. And there are 2 particular current events that he comments on. Apparently there were some Galileans whose blood Pilate mixed with the blood of sacrifices, and Pilate was a terrible human being. And so there's suffering that Jesus notes has happened in that. And then there's also this tower that has fallen on some people and killed them. And in both cases, Jesus looks at the audience that he's speaking to and says, you seem to think that the people that had suffered in this way suffered because their sin was greater than yours. You think their sinfulness is worse than yours, and the evidence of that is that they had to suffer these terrible things. And Jesus then looks at everybody and says, that's not really the way this works. Knock it off and change the way you live. And then we get this parable that Jesus tells. And the parable doesn't really seem to be connected, right? He's having this conversation about current events, and then he turns around and says there was a guy that had a vineyard, and he planted a fig tree, and after he expected it to bear fruit, and he came around and didn't see any fruit, he told the gardener to cut it down, and then the gardener had to plead for more time to fertilize it and do some work on it. Now that parable doesn't really seem to go with those current events stories, where the people Jesus is talking to are judging others' sinfulness by their suffering. But if you think about what the parable is trying to do and where we might find ourselves in the parable, they actually may go together better than we think. Parables are multi-layered. There may be another season where we hear this story and reflect on how we might be like the owner or the tree. But today I'm going to suggest that we identify with the gardener in this story. Because the gardener's job is to take care of the tree, to get the tree to bear fruit, to cut it back if it needs to cut back, to water it, fertilize it, whatever needs to happen. And the tree, if you think about the way Scripture talks about bearing fruit, often that means doing good works in our lives, right? So if you think about the tree as our own lives that are to bear good fruit and good works out in the world, then this owner is coming around and looking at the gardener and saying, why haven't you tended to this thing to make it bear fruit? Cut it down. Now, the gardener has to plead for time and say, well, hold on, there's things I can do, which implies that the gardener has not been really doing anything to that tree. And so if we take the two together, the current events where people are judging others for their sinfulness and their suffering, and then Jesus telling this parable, what he seems to be saying is, stop paying attention to the sin of others, stop judging the suffering of others, and instead turn around and pay more attention to your own life and how you might be tending to the health and growth of the good fruit that your life might bear. Now, we can look at these people all the way back then and say, gosh, they were judging people for their suffering and sin. But then we can ask, how does that work in our life? What is our national pastime? Baseball, yes. And some would argue that our national pastime has been surpassed now by football. But I would say our national pastime might actually be paying attention to other people's sin and judging it and comparing it to our own. If you take all of what we have on TV, and if you take out all of the things that pay attention to other people's sin and brokenness, and judges other people for their sinfulness, and looks at other people's suffering, what will still be on TV? Baseball. Right? So we have made a national pastime out of judging other people. We really do. If you're going to have TV on 24 hours a day and have stuff to comment on, at some point it's just going to be a whole lot of judgment. Judging other people's sin, judging people's suffering. We do it all the time. We can look at homeless people and say, well, gosh, how do they end up homeless? And come to a judgment at that, right? And think that their sin must be worse than ours, and their choice is worse than ours. But they don't have to be homeless people. I've had conversations with plenty of people who have the same exact opinions about their siblings, or their neighbors, or their friends. And when we can look at other people and see that their sinfulness is worse than ours and their suffering is worse than ours, just like I can look at other people and say their yard is worse than mine, then how do we feel about ourselves? Makes us feel better. Are we sinful? Of course we are, right? And so we get into this place where we get into these cycles of judgment, and then we don't necessarily tend to our own lives. In this story, we don't get a lot of detail, but it seems clear to me that the gardener has not been really doing anything to tend to this tree. He says, hold on, let me dig around it and fertilize it now. That apparently has not been done yet. And so the gardener's approach to this fig tree in the parable sounds a lot like the way I take care of my yard. If it's going to survive, it's going to survive. And if it needs care, well, then that's really too much just now. And if you think about our spiritual lives, there are lots of aspects to faithfulness, but generally I find that there's worship, prayer, generosity, service, relationships, and then the ways that we seek to understand our faith and engage with Scripture. And we can look at all of those things in our life and wish they were better, right? But then, do we do anything to actually change that? Or are we like the gardener and think, gosh, I wish I had a better prayer life, and then just hope that it happens, and hope that it bears fruit? Oh gosh, I wish I was more generous, but we don't do anything to change our approach to finances to make that possible. Or, oh, I wish my relationships were better, but I'm not going to ask for forgiveness or offer forgiveness or do any of those things that might actually make those relationships have space to thrive. So there certainly are things that we can do, and what the gardener in this story does, once threatening that the tree is going to cut down, then the gardener says, wait, I can actually do something now. Now this is dangerous territory for my Lutheran theological brain to head into, because we are saved by grace, not by works. So this story can land us in this place where we now have to wrestle with, are these things we're doing to try to tend to the tree of our faithfulness, are they good works that somehow make fruit grow? Are they good works that bring us into some better relationship with God? Or is there some grace that is happening here? Now, for all of the mess that my yard is, we do have this compost bin. And the things that go into the compost are leaves. And leaves are dead, right? They've already fallen off a tree. And then we put in there like banana peels and other fruit and vegetable scraps. All of that is now dead. Now, compost needs three things to work. And in Florida, it's easy because it's generally hot and wet enough. And then it needs air. So heat, water, and air. And you have to stir it. And if you stir it enough, all of that leaf and plant matter gets broken down into this really rich kind of compost fertilizer stuff. Now, I built a garden, and I've not had any success with my garden. I've tried to grow basil in it. That didn't work. I now have that in pots by the house, and if I water it enough, it seems to be hanging on. But one year, tomatoes just grew out of the compost. I didn't do anything. I just threw all the dead stuff in there, and tomatoes grew. So, I now had an opportunity to have some intention. So I took the tomatoes out and I moved them into the garden and made little mounds and watered them, and they bore fruit, and we were able to enjoy these tomatoes. Now, I took the seeds from those tomatoes and I looked on the internet and figured out how you get seeds to germinate and do all of that. So I did all of that for a season, and then I put them in a little egg carton and grew little tomato plants, and then I planted those in my garden. What happened to those? They all died. So the accidental garden thrived. The ones I tried to grow and put that sort of my effort into didn't work so good. Now, this year, the compost grew tomatoes again. So I moved them to the garden, but the rest of the compost was really done composting, so I threw it all in the garden, and more tomatoes grew. I have more tomato plants than I've ever had. They're all different heights, and some are bearing fruit better than others, but now I had this opportunity to give it some intention. And so I put up those little tomato cages and twine to hold them up, and I put a thing around it to keep the squirrels away, and I water them, and they're doing pretty good. Now, I went to stir my compost again, which I don't do frequently enough, and I found there were more things growing out of my compost that weren't tomatoes. So at that point, I was going to assume it was a weed, so I started stirring it and pulled it up, and what was at the bottom of that weed but a piece of potato. So now my compost is growing potatoes. Not because I'm good at it, they're just growing. So I let it be for a little while, and I went back after I stirred it, and now there are like dozen potato vines growing out of this thing. And I'm afraid to touch it, because I don't think potatoes will transplant as well as the tomatoes did. And I know if I stir the compost, which it needs to be stirred, that'll mess it all up, so I'm just leaving it alone. Now, all of this is how I understand grace to work. Grace is a gift that comes to us. It is not something we create. The tomatoes that showed up were a gift. The potatoes that have shown up are a gift. I did not do anything to make that happen. And they grew out of death. They grew out of dead leaves and dead scraps of food, and out of that death came life. If we think about the work that Jesus does to bring us grace, he grows to the cross where death happens. But out of that death comes life. And that gift of life is already a gift of grace to us. So the tension between grace and works, it isn't that we earn it, it's already ours because Jesus has died and been raised. The question then is, how do we live with that grace? Now, I could have just stirred up the compost and left all those tomato plants to go, but I had an opportunity to take this gift and move it and tend to it a little bit. And similarly with the potatoes, the tending is a little bit less. I just try to water them now and again. But the gift is there, and I have an opportunity to put some intention into it. So in this season of Lent, my hope for all of us is that we can understand that grace is a gift that we receive, and that we can put some intention into our lives of faith. And that may mean being intentional about prayer. It may mean thinking about the ways that we worship and coming to midweek worship, or finding other ways that worship can be a priority in our lives. It may mean working on our generosity and our service in the world and tending to our relationships and our engagement with Scripture in new ways. Now, how are we going to do with that? Sometimes we'll do all right. Sometimes we'll fail. What is it that the gardener puts around the tree? Manure. Is that not waste? So somehow, the waste in the story is what brings the growth. So even if we fail in the little bits of effort that we put into our spiritual lives and our faithfulness, somehow Jesus takes that waste and uses it to continue to fertilize and grow us as people. Now, we can't make the growth happen. just like those tomatoes and potatoes were just happening, all I've done with my little bit of intention is try to help with the environment that they are in. And so it is with our intention about faithfulness. We don't make the growth happen, but we tend to the environment a little bit. And I think part of what Jesus is saying is, if you stop spending so much time judging others, you might actually have time to tend to this other thing. If you don't spend all of your time engaged in the suffering of others and trying to figure out how they're more sinful, then maybe you can actually spend some time in prayer or in worship or in studying Scripture, trusting that those practices somehow shape us as God's people and grow us into the fruit-bearing trees that God created us to be. Amen.